Okay, we are live.
Yes, I can see it this time.
Do you want to introduce yourself first?
Sure. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our BPD and Stigma webinar. My name is Kellyann, and I'm really excited to do this webinar with the other super contributor today. Before we get into the main topic and to give people a little more time to join in, we will start with introducing ourselves. As I stated, my name is Kellyann. I'm really excited to converse today or this evening, depending on your time zone. I have borderline personality disorder, and I am committed to using my experience to educate people and facilitate supportive spaces. I am also a psychology student. I just graduated, yay. I have been a contributor for the Mighty for a little over 3 years now. I think it's actually coming up on 4, and I mainly contribute to the mental health and BPD sections and disability. I'm in Michigan. I'm about 40 minutes from Detroit, so feel free also to share where you're joining us from today in the comments. That would be cool to hear from you guys.
Oh, someone from Vegas. I am Morgan. I am a super contributor with the Mighty as well. I think I've been a contributor for 6 years now, which is a long time. I mostly write about BPD, and then my other main topic is OCD, is my sort of 2 hats I wear on the Mighty. So mostly mental health contributing. And I live in central Illinois, south of Chicago. What else am I missing? Oh, I am an MFA student in writing. So hoping to take this writing professionally.
Yeah, that's awesome. Something else that's also really cool is Morgan and I discovered that we grew up or were born in the same town. Yeah, it just so happened that way. So this was meant to be, Morgan.
Yes, it's a very random coincidence, but very cool.
Yeah. So for an overview, we're going to be talking about borderline personality disorder, specifically by addressing or breaking some of the stigma regarding this condition. And BPD tends to have a surplus stigma or a heightened stigma. So we will be brushing over our experiences with this and with BPD, maybe why we're talking about this, why with BPD is it different, and we'll be identifying some of the main stigmas, maybe how to address it, what can we really do about it, and just sharing our experiences and having a discussion with you all. Also, want to briefly mention, feel free to ask questions or say comments throughout. If we don't get to it at that particular point in time, we will also be looking through these at the end. So yeah, Morgan and I wanted to lay the foundation at the beginning of this webinar and really describe our experiences with BPD, sort of give a working understanding for some people out there who might not know what it is, and of course, to break the stigma, right? To address it, we kind of have to discuss maybe what is BPD for a better understanding, and feel free to comment if some of it resonates with you.
Yeah, so for me, do you hear that feedback? Oh, weird. Okay. The best way I describe BPD to other people is sort of just like an abundance of emotions, just huge emotions, and then a lack of coping skills to deal with those emotions. They have to be learned later. Or the other way I described it in a Mighty post was being cold-blooded emotionally. So we think of like warm-blooded, like you can regulate your temperature all on your own. Whereas cold-blooded, it's all about the environment. If it's sunny outside, you're going to be warm. If it's cold outside, you're going to be cold. Well, I'm emotionally cold-blooded, where if something happens, then I'm going to feel that. I have trouble regulating my internal emotional experience. It's very influenced by the environment.
Yeah, I think that's a really good description. Like BPD is really about emotion dysregulation. Like she said, like not really being able to regulate or cope with those. We tend to experience emotions very intensely. Not only that, but very hypersensitive to the environment and our internal states, and then some extreme difficulty regulating those incredibly extreme emotions. And to me, something that really captures my experience of BPD and what it's like is a description that Dr. Marsha Linehan gave. Some of you might recognize this if you're familiar with some of her writings. She is the creator of dialectical behavioral therapy. It's like maybe like feeling humiliated instead of embarrassed, or really, really abandoned and intensely rejected because of a little perceived slight or a normal brief separation, or maybe rage and intense anger instead of slight annoyances. And that's really some of the foundations of BPD. And there's this whole combination of BPD specific symptoms that impact my emotions and different interpersonal relationships and my sense of self and my thoughts and behavior. So all of these key areas are affected in BPD. Feel free to describe maybe some of your experiences with BPD specific symptoms in the comments if you guys wanted to discuss that.
Yeah.
For me, yeah. Sorry, go right ahead.
I think it's also worth mentioning, though, that like, while I feel bigger emotions like sadness and anger and all the like sort of negative emotions we consider negative, I also feel joy very extremely. So it's like, sometimes I'm like, I hate BPD. Why do I feel so sad? It's sometimes I'm like, this is amazing. I'm so happy. Like, I just feel everything at an extreme level, which can be.
Yes, that is, I think that's important to discuss and bring up. I think actually Marsha Linehan does include that in like her quote or something. She said, well, people with BPD also experience intense joy and they might be very idealistic. So that's really cool.
Yeah.
My friend said hello in the comments. Hello. I want to call you out there. Thank you so much for joining us today. Yeah, I guess like with some of my like main symptoms, I would say, like for me, I might experience intense anger because of the perception of a mundane event where maybe I think someone is like plotting to abandon me or hurt me, or intense frequent anger and anxiety, and paranoid ideation like relative to abandonment and being alone and stress are some of the main symptoms that I experience. I guess what I would say to further understand BPD is I think like maybe to get people to think of one of the times you were most upset. And with BPD, to me, it's like kind of having those reactions switching throughout the day and those extreme emotions multiple times a day. It's not really like what the stigma says, where we're like, oh, we're just, we're just being difficult or we're just being drama queens. Like, we're human beings who are in pain and experiencing symptoms.
And we're doing our best with the coping skills we have so far.
Yes.
For me, it kind of looked like in DBT, we learned the term unrelenting crisis versus uninhibited grieving. They're like the dialecticals where you keep having crises, but you're not able to grieve the crisis because all of a sudden you're in another crisis. And so that was it for me, where when I was in college, that I kept having to go to the ER, honestly, just because I was constantly in a crisis, had to delay exams, had to call the dean's office and get help with school. And it was just an unrelenting crisis, and you don't get time to breathe, which adds fuel to the fire.
Yeah, I think it's definitely one really difficult part of BPD is just constantly feeling those intense emotions. It's almost like I've heard people describe it as switching from one crisis to another. I did want to shout out Deborah in the comments real quick, who said like, going off of some of the positives we described with BPD, like, yes, idealistic, intense joy, and very sensitive to other people's feelings and can be very, very empathetic.
Yeah. And I think once you get good at like DBT and learn those skills, our emotional intelligence just skyrockets because we understand what other people are feeling and can relate and know coping skills to help other people as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's important to discuss with BPD, there's multiple components to what makes up the condition. So someone could be sensitive, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're very hypersensitive. That doesn't necessarily mean they have BPD or have intentional emotional experiences and emotion dysregulation. So it's really the combination of these things and a specific set of symptoms that really is what makes something BPD. I was just discussing that from a question I thought I saw in the comment. Someone else also asked, Gabby King.
That's what I was going to bring up. Yeah.
Yes. Would you like to go ahead and start first?
Yeah, I was just going to say, so this question is, does everyone who has BPD have an abusive childhood? The answer is no. Some do, some don't. It's not all or nothing. Like, it's very dialectical. Some do and some don't. It's not all or nothing.
Yeah, exactly. And it's funny, just mentioning real quick, because my camera is backwards, so like I think I'm pointing to you, but it's really this way. uh, but yeah, I think that was well said. People with BPD may have a combination of experiences, and that could include both emotional abuse or physical abuse or other types of abuse. That could include neglect. It could include separation. But other times it might be something that is a little bit more mundane. So like slight invalidation in the environment. I did not experience a trauma growing up that contributed to the development of my BPD. It's really important to understand that research shows, I think there was a compilation of 97 studies, so about 5,000 people with BPD. About 30% of them did not report any child abuse, did not report physical, emotional abuse, and even more different experiences. So I think that is important to discuss and address when fully capturing BPD experiences. So before we go into BPD stigma, I think it's important to note that BPD is treatable, and that is one of the main stigmas we will eventually go into. I don't know if you have any specific experiences with like a treatment that helped you out, Morgan.
Yeah, I went through a pretty intense dialectical behavioral therapy program, DBT, which was created by Marshall Linehan, like you mentioned. So I did the whole thing, the individual once a week, the group once a week. We went through all the modules: interpersonal effectiveness, mindfulness, emotion regulation. What's the last one? Oh gosh.
I'm sorry, distress tolerance, mindfulness, emotion regulation. Yeah,
yeah.
interpersonal.
So we went through all of them twice. We did it very by the book, Marshall Linehan. And I found that helpful. It took a while for it to feel helpful. It wasn't like I went for a month and I was like, wow, I suddenly have all these skills and I'm cured. It took a lot of practice because you have habits and you have to sort of replace those habits with coping skills that are healthier and more effective. Because that's really kind of what BPD is. It's using coping skills that aren't necessarily effective, but it's all you have. You have to learn more effective coping skills.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think Dr. Linehan does describe this, like, you know, the more intense and sensitive you are to things in your environment, then the more you might need certain types of coping skills, and then maybe the more you will need, the more often you'll need to implement them. So it's really this combination of things.
Yeah.
And for me, I went through a little bit of like, it was more of a DBT informed group.
Yeah.
I never unfortunately had access to very BPD specific treatment, which I really wish I did, but that is something that is unfortunate, is treatment tends to be very inaccessible. But there are various different types. There's dialectical behavioral therapy. There is mentalization-based therapy. There's schema therapy, and there is Gunderson's good or general psychiatric management. Both terms are used to refer to it. And there's a lot of different treatments out there. So one thing that I do want to address that I thought was important is BPD is treatable, and it takes a lot of work and it can take time, but there is skills and there are resources out there, which we will be sharing some more resources at the end of this as well. So
yeah, I think that's really important. That is a good segue into stigma. Is so often people think people with BPD are difficult clients, or they won't take them on, or that they're going to be hard to work with. And I think that's such a simplified and wrong view of people with BPD. It may be different to work with someone, but I think it can also be incredibly rewarding because, like we said earlier, they are incredibly loyal, incredibly empathetic. Our emotional intelligence is off the charts.
Absolutely. I think that's a really good thing to bring up. That's one of the main stigmas, is just don't work with people with BPD. And no one's saying that being a therapist is easy, right? I think that has a definite, set of difficulties. And there's a specific set of skills, especially going off of evidence-based treatments. Be very careful in the way that you implement them. And yes, it might be difficult to treat people with BPD, but I think it's important, like you said, to point out it's definitely treatable and it's worth it. And if someone kind of goes in with this attitude of like, well, I don't even want to work with them because it's going to be too hard, like that's not really going to be helpful. And BPD stigma tends to be really heightened, and it's not that other mental illnesses don't have stigma. Absolutely, they do. For depression, there's this stigma that maybe if someone is struggling with fatigue or motivation, that they're just lazy, right? Or it's more so that
just choose happy.
Yeah.
Gosh, I hate that.
Yeah, exactly. But with BPD or other less known conditions like BPD and schizophrenia, they tend to be very complex. They tend to be very intense, very heavily stigmatized. Research does show this, but it's also clear by looking at like textbooks or the way people talk about it sometimes, or experiencing it ourselves, that BPD stigma tends to be pretty rampant.
Yeah, I can tell a quick story of how I was diagnosed. Was just loaded with stigma. It was during an inpatient hospitalization, and the resident we're like in this tiny little room before COVID, obviously. And she like has the paper with all the questions, and she's like, oh wait, I have to rip off the top first. So she sits there while I'm sitting across from her, and she like folds the top back and forth and rips it off. I'm like, I can read upside down. I know it says BPD questionnaire. Like, she didn't want me to know. And then they didn't even diagnose me with BPD. They just diagnosed me with Axis 2, which is like the larger sort of theme. It wasn't until later when someone actually said the words BPD, but they were just so afraid for me to know they were asking about BPD and then afraid to say the words BPD. I just think it's so interesting that these are medical professionals and they were giving into that stigma a little bit.
Yeah, that tends to be where some of the most stigma comes from. I think there is research on this, that a lot of the stigma with BPD tends to often be professional specific. And for other people, sometimes, and more so in the community, they oftentimes find the diagnosis helpful in understanding someone's experiences. There was a current study it was a poster, but it's also currently in the process of being published. So with BPD symptom presentations, they tend to be very intense or in some ways chronic and very interpersonal. There's the sensitivities with social perceptions or some of the external anger. So like some people tend to stigmatize these things. Or for a more specific example, with suicidal ideation, our moods can change quickly. In my experience, I could feel suicidal for a few minutes or a few hours, and then it stops with the flip of a switch, and people may not understand, like, why were you intensely suicidal 1 second, and all of a sudden you're fine? So some people actually, like professionals without this experience might think like they're lying, they're exaggerating, they're not really suicidal, so therefore they're manipulative and they're lying. And so stigma comes from multiple areas, but I think that's just one example where people kind of look at some of our symptoms and they're like, what's going on here?
It can change so quickly. I know for me, there were times where I was incredibly suicidal. And then one time, by the time I walked to the ER, I don't know if it was just taking a walk outside in the cold. By the time I got there, I was like, well, I'm actually kind of fine now. I feel a lot calmer. And they're like, well, why are you here? Like, you're wasting our time. I'm like, no, like 30 seconds ago, I was not okay. And it can change so rapidly. And that's so confusing for people, which is valid for them. But I think they have to understand that our mood shifts a lot more than most people do in a day. Yes,
there needs to be some intense understanding and accurate descriptions of BPD in professional settings, absolutely. One thing that also really comes to mind when it comes to BPD and the stigma specifically is anyone familiar with the literature or research of BPD will tell you that historically professionals actually started using this term, borderline or BPD, to refer to patients they deemed untreatable or difficult in the sense that they are to be avoided without really any explanation of the symptoms when they were to use that term as an adjective. And using a condition that way for so long really sets up a lot of preconceptions. And it's like, if that is how you are using the term, then what exactly do you think of people who actually have BPD? What do you think of their symptoms? That use had to come from somewhere.
Yeah, that's such a good point. I didn't know that.
Yeah. And I'm not, here to point an angelic picture of myself because, someone shouldn't have to do that to not stigmatize BPD. There are symptoms of intense anger and suicide and self-injury and paranoid ideation, and under stress. Sometimes I might hallucinate under stress, but I'm a human being who experiences pain and symptoms that are overwhelming. And when you have a lack of access to resources and treatment for them, it's very difficult.
Yeah, and I think the important thing to mention is if you're not comfortable treating someone, or if you're not trained in treating someone, I think it's how you approach that. If you say like, oh, I don't want to work with anyone with BPD, that's different than referring them to someone who maybe has more training and is more comfortable, and making sure they're still getting help.
That is a great point, Morgan, to bring up. Like that, some people have specialties in certain areas, and that's completely fine to just understand and acknowledge, like, I don't have the tools, right? And sometimes that's where even some of the stigma came from, is, oh, BPD is untreatable, which we'll get into that. But really, it was people not really having some of the tools or treatment developments that were really helpful for BPD. I see a question real quick. I'm just going to just read it to myself to see if we can answer it now, or if we're going to potentially answer it as we go on. Awesome. Jackie Young. So this is, I know Jackie. We are also going to start discussing different ways to like address stigma and stuff like that after we start discussing some of the main stigmas. I think this is really important. So note this, everyone. What can we do in our communities, both professionally, personally, and maybe internally, and with communities around us? I think that's a really important question. There tends to be some very specific stigmas with BPD. I don't know, Morgan, if there's the first one that maybe comes to mind.
Yeah, for me, the one I dislike the most, and I've never had someone say this directly to me, or a professional, but I wonder, like, did they say it behind my back when they were talking with another doctor or therapist or whatever? But I hope they didn't. But the one that I hate is manipulative. I despise that word, because it implies that we're trying to hurt someone with our actions, when really it's because we're in pain and we're trying to cope the best that we can. People may get hurt in the process, but that was never our intentions, and we feel bad when we hurt other people. So I despise the word manipulative. I've basically removed it from my vocabulary, except when discussing BPD stigma, just because it's just, we're not trying to hurt people, and everyone makes mistakes and hurts people. People with BPD, people without BPD, we all accidentally hurt people. But to imply that people with BPD are trying to hurt people is very hurtful.
Absolutely. And Marsha Linehan does say, I don't like the word manipulative because it implies behavioral intent, right? Like you can't, you don't really know. Maybe someone with BPD, it's oftentimes, right, like maybe with self-injury, an emotion regulation attempt, not like an attempt to be a bad person or an attempt to control you. Maybe it's an emotion regulation attempt. It's an attempt to get their needs met. And and Marsha did explain, like if you withhold treatments and resources to people who are in intense pain, I can imagine you would be acting out in some ways too. And I think that's a really important stigma to address, is just this idea, this manipulative idea, in the sense that we're acting with a certain malicious intent. And then if someone has that point of view, especially if they're a professional, it shows when you interact with your clients or patients rather.
Yeah, I love that idea of we're just trying to get our needs met. And we're doing the best we can. And we say in DBT, I'm doing the best I can and I can do better, and not but I can do better.
Dialect.
So all the time, we're just trying to get our needs met. We're trying to regulate our emotions in the best way we know how. And there's no malicious intent.
Yes, absolutely. Another one that comes to mind is, we kind of touched upon this, like this idea that people with BPD are untreatable. Really, I feel like this stigma is based off of trying to treat a condition with treatment that was not adapted to it. I like think about trying to treat a condition with an approach that hasn't really been shown to be helpful with that particular condition. Does it make BPD untreatable, or does it make that particular approach or treatment unhelpful for that person? Like, it means that we need to have treatment developments or approaches for BPD, and if there aren't any, it doesn't make BPD untreatable. It means doctors don't have that tool. It's nothing to do with, and it's, again, we're not saying that it's an easy flip of a switch, all better now either. We understand that BPD symptoms are very difficult, but that is also another BPD specific stigma that might come up. And all of these stigmas are really attached, right? Oftentimes you'll face more than one. I did want to briefly discuss an experience that I faced with stigma as well. So after one of my college courses, the course had ended, and there was a group of 3 or 4 students that was around one of my professors. And they started describing these behaviors to him, like someone who lies and blah, blah, blah. Do you know what this is called? He goes, and I don't remember the whole details. This was 3 or 4 years ago, right? Actually, maybe more like 5 or 6. And they just were listing off really these negative stigmas. And the first thing he said was, "Oh, that's borderline, right?" He's like, "They're the ones who will fake pain to manipulate you." And he said, "Borderline humans." So this kind of goes into the stigma with using BPD as a adjective to refer to negative things without actually even addressing the main specific symptoms and what it is in the literature and research behind it. Just kind of like you hear something bad and you're like, "Oh, that's borderline, right?" And that, as you can imagine, I kind of left crying, but I didn't, I didn't say anything. And as someone with BPD, I shouldn't have to. If you don't have BPD and you notice it happening, don't, put all the work on people with BPD. Say something. You can always educate people on this if you notice it happening.
Yeah. I'm so sorry you had to hear that. That's awful. But I think you bring up a good point that I think as advocates, sometimes we're in the right mood, the right energy level, whatever, to advocate, but sometimes we're tired, or it's someone who has authority over us, and it's just not the right situation. And it's totally okay if it doesn't make you a bad advocate if you don't say something every time. If you feel comfortable, say something, go for it. All the more power to you, but it doesn't make you a bad advocate.
Absolutely. That's really important. Another specific BPD symptom, and if you guys experienced any BPD specific symptoms, feel free to share your experiences with us. We'd love to hear from you. I think attention seeking is another one. I know some people who rephrase that as support seeking. Again, this relates to kind of the manipulative symptom, trying to get your needs met. And yes, if I'm in intense pain and I'm experiencing intense symptoms from borderline personality disorder, at the same time, why wouldn't I want someone's attention and support and care? That's human. And just because someone with BPD is doing that in an intense way because of the symptoms we're experiencing, that doesn't make attention seeking in using that in this pejorative way.
I've also heard it reframed as attention needing, where if you're in pain, yes, you're seeking attention, but it's because you need attention and you deserve that and you are worthy of that attention.
That's okay. I've heard that. I think that's a really good explanation. I've heard Also, a book that I read, like, so what if someone is attention needing or seeking attention? Like, you need to look at the underlying reasons for that. Is there a symptom? Are they in pain? Are, you know, like, if I'm trying to seek out some sort of support and I'm experiencing intense hallucinations or suicidal ideation, like, maybe look at some of the underlying reasons for that instead of start at this surface level thought and kind of this prejudgment and say, oh, they're just attention seeking, and use that in like a bad way, or oh, they're just manipulative, right? Like, understanding some underlying reasons, I think, is really important.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Bryce? Oh,
yeah.
sorry.
No, I was going to bring up the same thing.
Oh, yeah. Bryce Bennett brings up, where's the support for males with BPD? All I see is support for females. Yeah, that's important. So one reason I love the Mighty is they do have a lot of male contributors with BPD, and they address this. And that goes into one of the other main stigmas, right? Is there's this idea for some reason that BPD was like a female disorder. It's not, and research does not support this.
No, not at all. It can be any gender.
Absolutely.
And go ahead.
It was an incomplete.
I was going to say, were there any other stigmas you wanted to address? Specific examples or stories you had?
I guess I had a similar experience when I was discharged from an inpatient stay, and someone was just doing like a 24-hour checkup. I went to see a social worker at the hospital, and she had kind of like brushed it off. Like, that was my main, difficulty was my BPD. And I said, yeah, this is what I was diagnosed with. And she goes, like, well, it's just, you just learned it from your parents. And I was like, I felt like she was insulting my mom. I was like, my mom is amazing. Thank you very much. Like, my mom is a therapist. My mom is loving. I grew up in a loving home. And I think it's important to hold both of these ideas true, that a lot of people with BPD experienced abuse and neglect and a lot of other difficult situations. And a lot of people with BPD grew up in a loving home where people had a difficult time responding to some of the intense symptoms, and equipping them with the emotion regulation skills they might need. And I grew up with severe social anxiety, to the point of where I didn't really speak in a lot of situations, and I wasn't like abused or anything. It was social. I had extreme social anxiety, just like a lot of people have social anxiety as a childhood. So that, to me, I had a difficult time communicating my needs. I had a difficult time really speaking, and I wasn't abused or neglected in any way. And I think to kind of push that on your client, which has been done to me multiple times, like, this happened to you, is really upsetting to someone. You don't really get to create their story for them.
Yeah, and it shows they're not listening either to invalidating. What people with BPD need most is validation of their emotions.
It was definitely invalidating, right? That's a type of invalidating experience when people kind of make those presumptions. Someone said, I don't know what's being asked, auditory hallucinations, ? I had BPD and PTSD.
Not sure either.
I don't know if they're asking if it happens, but I do want to say that there is some research on BPD and auditory hallucinations. I experienced them under intense stress. That's one main symptom of BPD, is experiencing paranoid ideation under intense stress, dissociation, or some people with BPD take that another step and transient hallucinations under stress, and I do. So I don't know if that's what was being asked, but I hope that's helpful. And that's also, again, where some of the stigma comes from, is people stigmatizing us for maybe my difficulty with responding to stress.
I'm just thinking back to what you said. I relate so much. I don't think I had social anxiety. I think it was the result of my OCD, but in stressful situations, I wasn't able to communicate. And that wasn't the fault of the people around me, and it wasn't my fault. It was just a communication barrier. And I think that's such an interesting idea that can create the invalidation, and it's not really anyone's fault. It's just a lack of communication.
Yeah, exactly. And like, my mom spoke with me. My mom was accessible to me. My parents and my siblings and people around me, like, I like how you said, like, it's not necessarily always fair to be like, it was everyone's fault. Like, so I think that with a lot of these main stigmas is one thing that Morgan and I wanted to address. And feel free to keep on commenting things if you guys have any questions or comments. If we don't get to them during this video or right now, we can always get to them at the end. And I also might brush through the comments on my Facebook account afterwards and just type to respond to you guys. But one thing we wanted to address was how hard it can be after hearing these things about ourselves or being treated a certain way and the internalized stigma that might come with this.
Mm-hmm.
So one way of describing internalized stigma might be endorsing or believing a negative misconception about yourself, maybe because you hear it repeatedly. So in my experience with BPD, sometimes I feel like I'm this like horrible, malicious person who no one wants to be around just because I'm experiencing pain. You know, I don't know if anyone has any experiences with that that you wanted to share with us, or if you experienced this ever, Morgan.
Yeah, for me, internalized stigma looks like a fear of disclosing. I'm very, very open about having OCD. You Google my name and like tons of OCD blogs and stuff come up. And I write about BPD, but not as often and not as openly. Yeah, that's my blog. And you'll see it's very OCD focused. Of course, this was before I knew I had BPD. That was years later. But this is my first time doing like a webinar about BPD. I've done so many about OCD, but I don't talk as openly about BPD. When I go to the doctor's office, BPD is not on my chart. I didn't disclose that. When I go to a therapist, I disclose it just because they kind of need to know that, and they're a mental health professional. So I'm hoping they'll understand it better. But yeah, I don't disclose it typically with like medical doctors just because of that internalized stigma. And maybe they would be actually, no, one of them, I did disclose it and she was like, I don't see you differently for that. She was amazing. She's saying, I don't see you as a bad person. I think that's terrible that people have led you to think that. So I have had good experiences, but it's still, you can be very fearful of what doctors and people will say if they have that stigma.
Laura Joanne Louise Court, and I sincerely apologize if I'm saying that wrong. I think this really relates to what Morgan was saying. I think it is hard to trust your gut instincts when you have BPD because it is so often stigmatized as you being oversensitive. I found it hard to trust my gut feelings and realize that boundaries are feeling crossed. Yeah, I think that is one consequence of internalized stigma is self-invalidation. Like, is my response appropriate? Because, I mean, sometimes, with BPD, some of the symptoms occur with very mundane things. And sometimes when there's like a reason, I'm like, is there like a reason to like experience this reaction that I'm having? There's this self-doubt because maybe in the past you've been told like you're overreacting, just stop. And it can lead to a lot of self-invalidation. I know that DBT tries to address some of this. Like using maybe if someone has the resource, like a therapist, to kind of discuss things with them, to have like a different point of view about maybe your response to something. There's self-validation skills. I think at one point, Morgan and I were discussing this. I think you had said you had like a therapist that you found helpful in coping with some internalized stigma.
Yeah, I had a thought and it just vanished.
That's okay.
Oh, I was just going to say I related with that question from Laura because so often I find myself asking, why do I feel this way? Why am I so sad? Why am I so anxious? And it really doesn't matter. I mean, different therapy techniques look at why in different ways, but something I find helpful is it really doesn't matter why I'm feeling this way. Like you can do a chain analysis and look at the behaviors and the coping skills that led up to this. But at the end of the day, what matters is how I react in the present moment and moving forward. So I choose to do effective things. Like for me, my biggest coping skill is making sure I remember to eat. When I get anxious, I forget to eat, and then I get hungry, and then I start crying. Yes. So I ate dinner before this. I have to have very scheduled meal times because I forget, and then I get all dysregulated. So that's like my favorite skill is making sure you're taking care of all the physical needs, like food.
Yes, that is called the PLEASE skill for everyone wondering in DBT. The PL stands for physical illness and like just taking care of your physical health. The E stands for eating, balanced eating. The A stands for like
that acronym is so weird. I never remember it.
Yeah, I thought this one was
avoid
food, altering drugs. S is sleep, and E is exercise. So basically, this scale is the goal is to like reduce your vulnerability to negative emotions. If you're not sleeping, not eating, if you're sick, all these other things, you stack that on to BPD symptoms, and that's like a trigger in and of itself. I think that's an amazing point, and that's really helpful with coping with some things.
Yeah. So in some ways, like it does matter why. Like it could be that I'm hungry, but otherwise, like I could just go eat and then solve that problem.
It's like hungry. I like to, like at the end of the day, if you're sad, you're sad. You don't have to say like, I don't have a reason. I think that's kind of, that's how I took sort of what you were saying.
Yes. You don't have to have a reason to feel whatever you're feeling.
Yeah, you don't have to, I usually connect it with something, sometimes a thought or something that happened that you may not even realize that you were as upset about, and that can be important, but someone, like, don't tell yourself, like, I don't have a reason to be upset. Like, that's not, like, you're a human being. Like, you don't, how you're feeling is valid.
Yeah. And if you have a reason, that's valid, but you don't have to have a reason to feel it.
So there were also like different ways that we wanted to discuss addressing some of this stigma. And I think this goes back to what Jackie Young was saying about addressing stigma in communities and how can we address stigma within people. Oh, there it is, right there. Hi friends, disclosure, I don't have BPD. What would you like to see in your communities that can help accommodate people with BPD or that you feel would reduce stigma? Anyone with BPD in the comments, feel free to share any thought or suggestion you have. It's important to get together as a community and discuss maybe what we would find helpful.
I love this question.
Yes, absolutely. I know Jackie from college from a long time ago. I think just the first thing that pops into my head, because we're doing it right now, is stuff like this can be helpful when it comes to reducing stigma and talking about it and helping people understand BPD. Is webinars like this, spreading information, educating, especially people with lived experience, including them in the discussion. That's the first thing that pops in my head because, well, that's what we're doing.
Yeah, I think talking openly when and if you feel comfortable and safe doing so, putting a face to the term borderline or whatever you want to call it. I really think we should stick with the full name if we're going to refer to it as that, like borderline personality disorder. Don't call people borderline. People are not borderline. That's so stigmatizing. At least to me, I find that stigmatizing. But I think putting a face to it, putting a face to these symptoms. So when a doctor or a therapist, they meet someone, they say, I have borderline personality disorder, or I think I have BPD. Does this match what I'm experiencing or whatever? If someone just mentions it to a friend, then they can put a face to it. And it's not all these sort of negative misconceptions that are taking the front seat.
Absolutely. Yeah, I actually briefly like brainstormed like what can we do to reduce stigma and what can we do to address this, and that's right there on my list. Correct the misuse of the term borderline. Don't use that as an adjective to people, and especially don't use that as an adjective to people when they don't even have the condition and they're just displaying some sort of maybe behavior that you find as mean or whatever the reason, and you say, oh, they're being borderline, right? We briefly discussed this back when we were talking about some of the main stigmas. Is if you notice that happening, maybe point it out. Don't do it yourself.
I think especially within like the mental health psychology community, addressing those stigmas. So like we need to address all stigmas within mental health. It can't be just addressing one condition like anxiety or depression. While those stigmas are valid and need to be addressed, you also have to be willing to take on, if people are going to use borderline in a hurtful way, that's part of being a mental health advocate. And again, like I said earlier, you don't have to advocate in every situation. If you're not comfortable, that doesn't make you a bad advocate. But if you are comfortable, including BPD on your list.
Absolutely. Another thing that I thought of was when it comes to BPD and mental health in general, I think something really needs to be done about integrating some of this education and school systems and school curriculums. I know that when I was in high school and things like that, I didn't learn about mental health or mental illness. I didn't learn about, especially about BPD. You hear things about the media, that's kind of the only exposure a lot of people had. Deborah, Berry, education.
Yeah. I think I learned some in my psychology class, but besides that, and not everyone takes that class, education was lacking in school. But I wanted to address, there was a question, I think, Jared, what are we calling BPD instead again? We're just, to clarify, we're saying don't call people borderline. Like that person's acting so borderline. We find that stigmatizing. You can still call it borderline personality disorder, BPD, that's what it is in the DSM. But our point is we find it stigmatizing until if you're like, that person's so borderline, or they're acting borderline, that's not helpful.
No. Yeah, thank you so much for clarifying that. I think that's helpful, especially if people are just joining into the live. Just for a quick reminder, everyone, this video will be posted on the page afterwards. So if you wanted to go back, rewind some things, kind of figure out maybe what we were referencing, because I know we're referencing some things we already talked about. Feel free to do that. That would be great.
Yeah.
Erica, yay, one of our super contributors.
Yeah.
Yes, I didn't hear this term until like 4 years ago. Yeah, to me, putting a name and a description to what it was I was dealing with was incredibly validating and helpful to me, to help me identify my struggles and plan and cope ahead. And having a word really was helpful. And I'm not saying that, the term borderline personality disorder is the most updated definition of it.
No, it's not a great term in itself.
That's what we're talking, about right now. Like, but I the fact that there was something that I was like, wait, how did they know this about me? Like, what? You mean there's a condition that goes into all these symptoms? Because depression and anxiety, bipolar disorder, none of these things describe my experience. I felt so alone. And I was like, whoa, like it was me right there on a page.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I also found having a diagnosis or a word helpful and validating, because I knew I had OCD and I was like, this fits perfectly, but why? What is all of this? Because this is not OCD. These extreme emotions and these trying to cope in the best way I can. I mean, there can be overlaps, but I was like, what is this? Oh, there's a word for this. Of course, the doctor was scared to tell me that word because of stigma. But eventually, someone told me the word, and I found it helpful.
Yes, absolutely. Just to quickly throw back to Jared's comment, we're not saying that you can't say that you have borderline personality disorder, that you're borderline if you actually have it. I do that all the time to myself. I'm like, well, I mean, I am borderline, whatever. We're saying like, don't call people that when they don't have it, when they're acting in a way that is like just violent or something, because that is a stigma that is sometimes used, right? Like someone will act in a very violent or hurtful way. And sometimes mental health professionals or other people might just, oh, they're borderline, but they don't actually have the symptoms of the condition. They're just using it in a stigmatizing way. That's more so what we were.
Yeah, you're free to self-identify in whichever way you want. But when you have the condition, you can self-identify however is comfortable
and
for
if
you.
that works for you, that's great.
Yeah.
And when it comes to like discussing different like accommodations, Jackie originally asked, we discussed some ways that we can reduce stigma in our community. But having a background in disability studies, I think of like just how it's important to ingrain some of these accommodations into, like, for example, school settings, and how I found it helpful for me with coping with my BPD. Like, for example, I receive disability accommodations at my school for my BPD. If I start experiencing intense emotions or intense symptoms right in the middle of a class, like, I'm allowed to step out for like 5 minutes or so and catch my breath and maybe do some coping skills. Or if someone has an app on their phone they find helpful in reducing symptoms, maybe that might work, and then I can come back in. Or maybe if there's triggering content. And so when it comes to addressing stigma of BPD, there's a lot of different ways to do it, but it's also important to address it in the way that we really support each other and accommodate each other, and the relations we have, and that's for all settings, right? So school settings, communities, and that's one really important accommodation that I have found helpful, is just people understanding that you need that flexibility with things. Sometimes if someone is symptomatic and maybe they have to, if they can't hang out that day, and maybe I tell my friend, like, I'm having a really hard time, can we, hang out tomorrow? Like, be flexible with me and understand that maybe I'm just having a really hard time. Or maybe if I say, like, I really want to hang out with you, but I'm having a hard time leaving the house, a helpful accommodation would be like just understanding these symptoms and showing that in that relationship with that person. Maybe instead of me getting out of the house, maybe that person comes to me and we just have a movie night or something. And so I guess I'm just brainstorming ways that, like, people with BPD might find helpful in their relationships. And just validation is really important. Refraining from judgments. So instead of like, oh, this person's just difficult, or stop being manipulative, maybe look at some of the underlying reasons for that.
Yeah, I think validation is one of the greatest ways we can address stigma. You don't have to agree with the person. You don't have to think you would feel the same way, but you can be understanding of their feelings and validate that what they're feeling is valid and it's their experience, and that's okay. Even if you would feel totally different in the same situation. That's
absolutely
how they feel.
Yeah, I think you brought up a really good point about, like, defining validation doesn't mean that you agree. Validation doesn't mean that you're like, you're totally right, everything's right. Like,
yeah,
it's more so talking about, like, how you understand that they're upset. I understand that this person is upset. It's about really maybe even paraphrasing the experience that they're having, reflecting to them that you understand that what they're going through is difficult, instead of saying, like, oh, you're sensitive, or you're being too sensitive, I mean. And that is a helpful way. That's helpful for everyone. Everyone needs validation.
I am all team validation nation.
Yes, absolutely. Team validation. That should have been like the title of our webinar. Team
next
validation.
time.
Start over and rename it. No.
Did you have other things on your brainstorming list you wanted to share?
I personally don't have anything.
Okay.
If you have anything, feel free to head it our way. But if anyone has any questions, feel free to ask any last minute questions before we log off here.
Yeah. I think.
Awesome. Well, this was great. I enjoyed having this discussion with everyone.
Yeah, thank you.
I think it was very fruitful. Hopefully people learn a lot, like we said. Oh, there's also some resources in the comments. So Emotions Matter is a BPD organization. They have peer support groups. They have a list of books and other things that you can check out. There's a resource tab. And then there's also the National Education Alliance for Borderline Personality Disorder that you can check out as well. They have similar resources. I just wanted to share those for anyone who might find it helpful.
Yeah, always good to give resources. I've actually never heard of either of those, so I'm going to check those out.
Oh, awesome. I'm glad it was helpful.
Yeah.
I'm just looking at the comments, guys. Sorry, I keep getting distracted. Every now and then I'm looking at the comments and I'm like smiling at like a very weird point in our conversation. You know, like we're talking about something that's difficult and I'm like, oh, that's a nice comment. Someone called us pretty earlier on in the in the comments, and I was like smiling at a time when I was like talking about suicide. I was like, so I got distracted. Thank you. That was really sweet. We loved having this discussion. I love how the Mighty shows that people with certain illnesses are people too.
Thank you,
I am
Maya.
a person.
That's awesome. Yes.
Absolutely. Humanizer.
That's awesome.
Thank you, Miss N. Thank you, each and every single one of you. Feel free to replay this video when it gets posted.
Thank you. So thank you, Kellyann, for doing this.
Thank you so much for joining me. This was awesome.
Yeah, I think I learned a lot.
Absolutely. Bye.